Just bringing up the text. There we go. Okay, I hope everyone had a nice weekend. Let's get started. We are up to Sif Tes Zayin in the Rav Shulchan Aruch on the laws of Ona and Genevas Das. Here we're talking about not giving full disclosure in the course of a transaction, which could cause a misunderstanding and embarrassment or upset. And so the last halacha that we saw is even when you're giving a gift to someone, don't give a gift that could easily be misconstrued or misrepresented that could have caused the other person embarrassment. So the example that was given was that don't send your friend a barrel of wine that has a layer of oil on the top so that he might mistakenly think that it's all oil and then invite guests assuming that he can cook now, and then he'll realize that he can't and he's going to be embarrassed. So in Sif Tes Zayin, it gets back to transactions. Lo yimkor or shel nevela b'chezka shchuta. You should not sell hide of carrion of an animal that died of let's say of old age, b'chezka shchuta, and misrepresented as an animal that the hide is from an animal that was slaughtered. So what's the difference? See, we wouldn't know such things, right? Ki or hanavela inu chazak kol kach kimo or hashchuta v'nimtza mita'ehu. He says the hide from an animal that died of old age, a nevela, right, is not as strong in its constitution as a hide of an animal that was slaughtered. And I guess maybe that when you harvest the pelt at the prime of the animal's life, it's a much better quality pelt. So that's clearly misrepresentation. I suppose, when it comes to clothing, if you tell someone that something was manufactured in Canada versus whether it was manufactured in China, right? So that would change the desirability, even if it's the same fabric, right? But the workmanship is different and the attention to detail is different. It's the same kind of thing. Don't misrepresent the product. Yud Zayin. Asr la'adam limkor lechavero karka o metaltalin sheyesh aleim esek v'din la'eza adam. He says you're not allowed to sell a piece of property or a piece of chattel to a person that may be encumbered by some kind of legal claim. Ad sheyodienu lelokeach, until you inform the buyer. She'afal pi shehachrayus olav, even though that the other party, let's say, has a responsibility to make good on that encumberment in some way. In other words, or even though, let's say, what he really means to say is the seller is going to have to take care of all of the legal wranglings that will be involved in staving off the person with the encumberment claim. But nonetheless, ein adam rotza sheyitin ma'osa v'yerid ladin v'yeh nitva me'acher. But he says, but in other words, even though the buyer is not going to be on the hook to deal with that claim that is on this property, and all of the financial encumberment is on the seller, but you still have to disclose it to the buyer. And the reason is because even though a buyer may not have any financial liability in that encumberment claim, but no one wants to be a party to litigation. In other words, no one wants to have to go through the hassle of going to court and being summoned and going through papers and documents and things like that. So that, in other words, this halacha essentially tells you that even when you, let's say I have a claim on, an outstanding claim on this property, right? And I know that the outstanding claim will not result in the confiscation of the property, but I, as the seller, will have to pay off whoever has this financial claim on the property, right? Let's say there's some kind of mortgage that's left on it. So if I don't notify the buyer, I'm guilty of geneva stas. I'm deceiving the buyer, because even though the buyer will never have to necessarily deal with the creditor, but he may get threatening letters and things like that, and he may even, have to be summoned to court, or may have to be deposed, and all of these things. It's a hassle. No one likes that, and therefore you have to notify the buyer in advance of any kind of potential for legal claim. Okay, so let's take a look at the next halacha. These are fairly straightforward, right? So there's no reason for us to dwell on them. But let's go on to the next halacha. This has to do with misrepresenting a product to make it seem newer or younger than it really is. Asur lefarches es ha'adam uvehema v'kelim ha'omdim lihi macher. So you're not allowed to dye or color a human, an animal, or inanimate objects that are going to be sold. And to color, what we mean is to misrepresent them by painting over them, or painting over their blemishes. Okay, kagon. Adam, he says, kagon eved kanani shuhu zakein. So what do we mean by human beings? Let's say you have a slave, when slavery was in practice in the ancient world, and you want to sell a slave, but the slave has gray hair. And so people are not going to want to buy the slave because they think the slave is too old to do any work. So, and so you go ahead and you dye his hair so that he should look young. And therefore you'll fetch a higher price on the slave market. Now, you may think that this has no practical applications in halacha, right? Because we don't have slavery anymore. But let's think about, what about labor situations? What about a person who wants to hire himself out for manual labor? Would he be allowed to dye his hair so that he'll get hired? Because if the people see that he's an alter kaker, they're not going to want to hire him. Is that permitted? So that's something that we should think about. And we're going to see that the Imrei Yaakov is going to take up this discussion, because Rav Moshe also has a tshuva. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva about these kinds of things. What about not just for manual labor? What about for a shidduch, right? Can a guy dye his hair, or in order to be able to represent himself as being younger than he really is, because he wants to get a nice young girl for a shidduch when he's already an alter bacher? Okay, so these are the kinds of things that we'll have to talk about in the course of this halacha. What's an example of a behema? Let's finish the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Ubehema lahashkosa mesubin shemenafchin osa. How would you misrepresent an animal? So you would give it bran water. Now, what is bran water? It is liquid that has been permeated with bran. So what does bran do? If you've ever eaten bran, you know that it fills up your kishkas, like Metamucil or oat bran or things like that. It's good because it keeps you regular, but it also can distend your belly. And that's really what is going on over here. You want the animal to look more distended in its belly so that it looks like it's fat and good quality, right? Vizokfin sa'aroseha kedei sheteira'eh shemena. And also what someone may do is that they will comb the animal's hair so that it sticks up. use like Brill cream on your animal so that it looks bigger than it really is. Okay? V'chein aser lekaredu lekartsefosa kidei liskov saroseh. So first of all, this bran water makes the hair stand on end. Besides making the belly distended, it also makes the hair stand on end. But what's also usher is to manually take a comb over its back and to make its hair stand up. And those are examples of doing acts that would be misrepresentative of the animal. And then what's an example of inanimate objects like kalim, like utensils? Asr litzava sheyera'u chadashim. You're not allowed to paint them on the outside so that they look new when really they're used. Okay, like the used car salesman who paints over the rust, right? Ve'ein hashevach shemashbicham b'tzeva kemo ha'iloi shemala osam b'damin. And the paint job that you do does not raise the price to the level of what they're being represented as being new utensils. In other words, it's true that sometimes a good paint job on a car will raise its value, right? Because paint in itself is expensive. So as long as you're not misrepresenting it, and you tell people that it's a 15-year-old car, and it just has a new paint job, that's fine. But if you represent it as being newer than it is, that's where you get into problems. Because if people think that it's new when it's really used, you're deceiving the buyer. But what you are allowed to do is if they are already new and they just have like a gray exterior and they look a little dull, and you want to catch the eye of the buyer, that you're allowed to do. There's nothing wrong with making your product more eye-catching by painting it a bright color, as long as you're not misrepresenting it. He says anything that you can do to beautify your product so that we will fetch a higher price, even though the paint job doesn't necessarily increase the quality of the product, but it just makes people want it more. He says there's nothing wrong with that. If people are willing to pay more for a product that's painted a bright orange or a bright red, and you figured out how to get the market to pay more for your product, there's absolutely nothing wrong, because people many times are willing to pay more for something that is more attractive to the eye. Hol ve'in kantos va'ona. He says, in this case, there's no deception involved. There's no ona'ah of overcharging, because even though a person can say, well, I can get the exact same widget for 20% less, you say to him, of course you can, because it's not painted bright red. If you want a bright red widget, well, there are a lot of people who just enjoy the eye candy of a red widget over a dull gray widget, right? He says because people do pay for aesthetic improvement, right? Are we right? So what are some examples of that? People will sometimes pay more for a red car than they would pay for a black car or a gray car, not because the car itself is any better because it's red, but it's got the eye candy value, right? And so
real estate.
What's that?
Real estate.
Real estate, sure. Any kind of real estate that you do some nice landscaping to it, or let's say if you want it, everyone will tell you when you want to sell a house, you gotta paint it, right? And everyone knows that the paint job may cost, let's say, $10,000, but the fetching price that you'll increase the house by may go up by $50,000, just because you took the time to paint it and to make it look, to do an external aesthetic improvement to the house, right? It's not.
Question.
There's no deception involved there. Yes, Izzy.
What about staging? where they take the smaller furniture and put it into the house to make it look bigger and verschiedene Sachen like that.
Yeah, I don't see that there's no deception there. What you're doing is you're demonstrating for your prospective buyer how nice this house can be if they use a little creativity, right? So, but there's no deception involved, right? Because the customer knows, the buyer knows that the house does not come with the furniture that you're staging it in, and you're just showing them, look, this is what the house can look like. You're putting your best foot forward without deceiving the buyer. Okay, but so there's a difference between painting a new widget red versus painting an old widget red, and you're therefore guilty of misrepresentation. Okay, all right, let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov.
Rabbi, that first example we started with dyeing your hair gray. If you were to put on your resume exactly what your age is, then why is painting your hair different? I mean, I know all the halakha about men dyeing hair, but if it wasn't for that, why is that different than painting your car, your walls? You're not deceiving because you've told them what your age
All right,
is.
yeah. So Paul, we're going to go a little bit into this more when we go into the biurim. I want us to take a look at this whole inyan when we're going to see now the biurim shortly. Okay.
Okay, great.
Lifarches, it just says pirish litzboa, it means to color or to dye. Eved Kanani, if you have a Gentile slave. Aval Eved Ivri Asr La'achar HaChurban Shenayovel Noheg. There's no slavery of Jews since the destruction of the temple, but there is theoretically the possibility of slavery of non-Jews, even post-temple destruction, right? And that's just a piece of historical information because there's no slavery today at all, right? Shuhu Zakein, you want to dye the hair of a person who is older than he's being represented. Nira de davka bizakein yesh le'asor. He says it turns out that you should only prohibit this when the slave is already an older person. Aval imhu bachur rak shenislabnu sa'arosav bazeh ein le'asor shari kocha yafa ke'eved acher. He says, but the Imrei Yaakov points out from the poskim that let's say this guy is a 25-year-old strapping young man, and he went prematurely gray. And you're worried that people who see this premature gray 25-year-old man are going to think that he's 40, and they're not going to want to buy him. So that, where there's no deception, you are allowed to dye his hair. The only time you're not allowed to dye his hair is if you're making him younger than he really looks. But let's say he looks older than he really is, and by your dyeing his hair, you're just bringing him back to the perception of of his true age. So that would be okay. Okay, so therefore, it's permitted for representation purposes to dye hair in that scenario. Okay, we're gonna go more into that now, and I want us to examine that idea. Okay. So first, he quotes, let's take a look at the biurim here for a second. He says, B'sefer darchei tshuva yoredeya siman kuf pei beis sifkat niyad zayin, hevi b'shem kama achronim, shadanu b'she'ela b'ish tza'ir liyamim, shenisla ben chatzi sa'ara uzakana, shechelek echad nasa lavan, v'hasheni nishar shachor. There was a young man who was the subject of the following shaila. Half of his beard became white, and the other half remained with black hair. And he became a laughingstock. In other words, people would look at him, and he was a curiosity to look at. For the doctors on the line, I think there's a condition where you get just some of your hair gets white prematurely. Is there a name for that condition? Can anyone tell me? Either Joby, Alan, if you're on the call.
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any name. probably a name for it, but I can't think of it.
Okay, but have you ever treated someone like that, or what do you tell them? Just to dye your hair?
If they're distressed by it, absolutely. It's the level of distress.
Okay. Anyway,
Isn't there also a concept? Isn't there also a concept of a birthmark, where you might have a patch of white in your hair from birth?
yeah, it could be. It could be, right? There's like some kind of a dye deficiency, especially I think actually black people may sometimes there's into dago or something like that. I forgot the exact name, where there's blotches on the skin of pigmentation.
There's a condition called
Vitiligo.
vitiligo,
Yeah.
which Michael Jackson had, where he started to become depigmented. So there are conditions of depigmentation of the skin. It can happen in the hair as well.
There you go. Okay. So this guy had some kind of depigmentation of his hair in his beard. So like he had like this shock of white hair, so that half of his beard was white and half of his beard was black. And he was very embarrassed by it. Ishari litzvoa sa'arosav halavanos lishchar. Would it be permitted to dye his hair in that case? That was the shaila that was brought to in the Darchei Tshuva, which is a compendium of different responsa, and Lomaskana Kasvu Le'asar. And so the initial conclusion was that it's usher to do that. And the reason is the Kaven Shekasov Harambam Beperik Yud Beis Mehilchos Avodah Zarah Halacha Yud Shahad Soveya Sa'aro Shachor Mishayitzba Sa'ara Levana Echas Loke Min HaTorah. Okay, that if a person shahatzoveya sa'aro shachor mishayitzba sa'ara levana echat. Oh, that if you dye, let's say even one hair of your head or of your beard becomes white and you dye it black, then you get malchus. So in Cain ein la hakel bazeh afilu b'makom bizayam, and therefore you should not be lenient at all, even in cases of where there's embarrassment. And what is the reason for that? So if we take a look at the Rambam in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, just give me 1 second. See here. Here. The laws of idolatry. Perek Yud Beis. Perek Yud Beis Halacha Yud. The context of all of this is prohibitions of cutting your hair in ways that are imitative of Gentiles, and that's why it's in the laws of idolatry. And in the course of doing that, the Rambam also writes the prohibition of lo yilbash gever simlas isha, that a man is not allowed to dress up like a woman, and a woman is not allowed to dress up like a man. And he includes that in the laws of idolatry. And he writes as follows: Lo ta'adeh isha adeh ha'ish. A woman is not allowed to dress up like a man. Kagon shetasim barosha mitznefes okova. She's not allowed to wear like a turban or a hat like a man. O shetilbosh sirion v'chayotzebo. Nor should she wear military garb like a man. O shetikaleach rosha kish, or that she's not allowed to shave her head like a man. V'lo ya'adeh ish adeh isha kagon sheyilbosh bigadim tzivonim. A man may not dress up like a woman, like wearing colorful clothing, v'chali zahav b'makom shein lovshin osan hakelim, or to wear some kind of gold jewelry in a place where men don't normally wear that jewelry. Ve'ein mesiman osahacholi ela hanashim hakol kemenag hamadina, or to wear any kind of jewelry that normally only a woman would wear. Now, ish sha'ada adei isha v'isha sha'ada adei ish lokin. And if they do such a thing, that if a man wears a woman's garb or vice versa, right, to be a tranny, right, quite frankly, is an isser deoraisa, right, and you get malchus for that. So anyone who says that you're you're transphobic, you should say, no, I'm not transphobic. I just feel that the Torah prohibits that kind of activity. Now, Hamalake tsa'aros levanos mitoch hashchoros merosho umizakano, that if a person plucks out the white hairs out of the hairs on his head, o mizakano, or from his beard, mishiyalake tsa'ara echas loke mipnei she'ada adei isha. So from the moment that he plucks out even a one white hair, he gets malchus, because he is doing what women do. He is engaging in feminine activity. And similarly, just dyeing one white hair makes you liable for malchus. Okay, so that's what the Rambam writes in this halacha. The whole theme of this halacha is men should not do that which women do. Okay, so that's the basic halacha. And so based on that, the Darchei Tshuva wanted to say that it's usher for a man to dye his hair. Now, we're going to see that that's not the maskana of the halacha. So I just want you to hold on to that, and we'll go more in depth in this tomorrow. I also want you to think about just something in general. Is there any desire to eventually change the start time of the shir, as we start to reopen our shul and minyanim and so forth? Like, I know that some people have stopped attending the shir because they have to go to minyan morning. Is there a desire to start the shir earlier or not? Please let Alan Mall know, or you can weigh in on the chat on the WhatsApp group. And let us know whether you'd like to keep it at 6:30 or whether you'd like to move it to a little bit earlier. Anyway,
Rabbi, just quick question:
Yes.
Is there a plan to add back like a 7:30 approximately minyan or something?
Yes, we're planning, God willing, either later this week or beginning of next week, to institute a 7:30 or 7:40 minyan. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Take care.